there's all these other market opportunities. There's a new authorization through AB 2868 that was passed that really encouraged utilities to look at how energy storage could be used for resiliency and really a focus on low-income and public sector customers. And I think the key aspect of really growing the pie was, because they had this energy storage target and because they actually had critical timely procurement needs with the limitations of Aliso Canyon. So Aliso Canyon, it's a underground natural gas storage facility that feeds 18 very critical peakers, gas peakers in Southern California. But there was a leak that caused the governor to set a moratorium on that resource, and so the 18 natural gas peakers in that area potentially did not have this backup resource of gas. And so this presented critical reliability needs, and given the experiences from the previous solicitations, the commission reached out to CISA, reached out to other stakeholders to see, can energy storage actually meet a real need in a very expedited fashion. And lo and behold, a lot of our CISA members were able to really deliver on some of those projects. And within a 6 to 8 month time frame, we had these systems go from procurement in I believe it was June 2016 to COD, so commercial operation, by December. No, it's June 2017 to December 2017. Or was it 2016? I forget. But either way, it was an 8 month time frame, and that's unheard of for an emerging industry. And a lot of these technologies were lithium-ion. Lithium-ion benefits from an immense supply chain that allows it to scale and really redirect resources to a critical need. We saw that with the Tesla projects in Australia. I think I've actually heard from residential developers who use Tesla batteries actually face supply chain delays because of that, because of Elon Musk's tweet. So you saw how supply chains can really shift, and so of course it's an indication of we still need to build out our capacity to manufacture these systems. That was really critical for a major reliability need, but there was also a solicitation for a economic need. So gas plants here in California, they're facing very tough economic conditions because, like Michael said, these systems are only operating with 10% capacity factor. And this is in Texas, where Texas you're allowed in the wholesale market for prices to spike during peak hours. Whereas here in California, there's caps. There's a capacity market, or not a bilateral capacity market that kind of depresses some of the energy prices. So these gas plants can actually recover their full cost through the market. And so a lot of these gas plants that have 10% capacity factor, they're facing potential retirement. And these resources are just not making money, but they have to, so they're considering retiring. And so this is presenting another reliability need. And so there's tools that the ISO has to potentially procure energy storage at very costly, it's called backstop procurement contracts. And instead of doing that, they wanted to see, is energy storage more cost effective than these backstop procurement contracts? And we saw PG&E just announce their procurements in the summer, I think 3 months ago, and there was actually CPUC tentative approval today, so very timely news, approving these energy storage procurements. And we're talking one of these energy storage procurements are actually for 380 megawatts of energy storage, and so it would, once online, it would be the largest energy storage project online. But of course, largest is, something's always going to surpass the largest, so that happens. And lastly, there's a self-generation incentive program that provides upfront and performance-based incentives for the customer segment. The commission or the legislature continues to reauthorize more money into it. And even though $400 million seems like a lot, if you think about the California Solar Initiative, which was a $3 billion program, behind the meter energy storage still has many ways to go. And I think these are all great tools. Growing the pie, these are great tools to grow the energy storage market from the top down. But I think as energy storage becomes more mainstream, it's critical for energy storage to be properly valued in grid planning. The reference system plan is something that Luisa mentioned before, but this is part of the CPUC's effort to identify what's the most optimal resource mix for us to achieve our GHG emission goals by 2030, by 2045, et cetera. And so when they conducted this very complex modeling exercise, they ended up with this type of portfolio. And basically, the key takeaway is we're looking at what the most cost-effective portfolio for California is, a heavy solar portfolio. And a heavy solar portfolio, which is doesn't have a very diverse renewable resource mix, presents a lot of problems. And so, our team actually took the IRP assumptions, so the modeling assumption that the CPUC took, and modeled it to 2030, what the what the net load would actually look like in California. And we're seeing basically many periods of overgeneration, very difficult ramps that have to be met. And this is an opportunity great for storage, right? Of course, this is very debatable. Some people think we should diversify our renewable mix so we don't have these problems. Some people argue for regionalizing California, so Arizona and California kind of had different peak times, and so maybe we could potentially connect with Arizona to push out all the solar. But at least with the policies in place today, this really highlights a critical need for storage. And so, and this is not just a springtime issue either. So I haven't shown all the graphs here, but looking at the summer and the fall, we're seeing very steep ramps that energy storage probably has an opportunity to backfill. And so, in these models, I think it's important to demonstrate what the value of energy storage is, how can we actually solve this problem, and so it's critical to be participating in these efforts to make sure that the storage costs going into these models are correct, whether we're actually taking advantage of coupling opportunities of storage plus solar plus wind, and how they're actually representing the economic conditions faced by gas resources. Because really, these steep ramps and these peaks are what are keeping gas plants alive today. And as part of the improving the valuation, I think it's important to develop the frameworks to develop market products. There's flexible capacity products that need to be developed. Right now in California, the flexible capacity product is not appropriately compensating for storage's capabilities. How can we actually represent the value of solar plus storage and wind plus storage? In California, you'll rarely see any solar plus storage or wind plus storage procurements, even though it seems very obvious. We're seeing that in Colorado, Arizona, but those are all vertically integrated systems or utilities. And so in California, we have to develop the regulatory frameworks and planning tools to show why solar plus storage is valuable, why wind plus storage is valuable, and also developing multi-use application frameworks. A lot of the companies that are represented, that we represent, they're trying to use software tools, use software tools to really to manage their capacity, manage not only the operations of these storage systems, so that we're not prematurely degrading these systems, but also to pursue different revenue streams. So during certain months, they might provide capacity. During certain months, they might provide transmission deferral, distribution deferral. And so they're really trying to identify, okay, let's look at all the different grid needs. Let's try to develop a system that could potentially optimize around these different value streams and see how we can actually maximize the capacity that we deploy. And so that's actually a fascinating puzzle to try to solve. And lastly, this is probably the most boring of the factors, but reducing barriers. So, you know, when we try to deploy these energy storage systems, we can't just willy-nilly, export to the grid, because there are reliability impacts to how you operate your storage system. And so there's, interconnection processes where the utility engineers, the ISO engineers actually study how your system is operating, and potentially if your operations cause overloads on their substations or their circuits, they might, force you to pay for that network upgrade to increase that capacity. And these are the types of things where I think, we need to focus on how storage can actually avoid some of these situations. Since, old school utility perspective has always been, let's study for worst case impacts. Everything is fine until, the outage happens and the utility just gets blamed and blasted by customers. And so, they have this very conservative mindset. How can we get around some of these and use some of the tools that we have to get around them? Developing standards and standard testing tools to allow for comparability of different technologies, I think, is an important barrier, especially for emerging technologies. And then wholesale market participation barriers. Lisa touched upon this as well, but California really has the market participation models to see how energy storage can actually be bid into the market, how they can actually represent what their marginal costs are, their fixed costs are, et cetera. So, some of the key takeaways, I think, I know I focus a lot on California because that's what I know best, but as you look at different states, I think it's important to look at whether there are policy drivers that kind of drive that early market growth, whether the pie is growing with new solicitation opportunities, new mandates that really drive the early stage of the market, and then consider how the state is actually focusing on policies and tools and planning models to improve the valuation of energy storage, because at some point these are going to become mainstream technologies. And lastly, some of these things I think are really important factors that affect the cost effectiveness and deployment of these projects, but focusing on interconnection standards and market participation models to reduce barriers for deployment. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't you just hold on to that? So, was going to come up, and one thing I wanted to, also notice you talked about how storage was able to come up and meet some of the challenges here in California. I remember seeing that. Let me get this up here. So we have something to look at. I remember seeing something about in Australia also. They had a kind of an emergency situation where Elon Musk stepped in with Tesla, was able to provide a grid storage solution that, from what the indications I saw, was also very successful. So I think we've seen a couple situations at least where storage has stepped into kind of mission critical situations and been able to quickly, by utility standards. It's been able to quickly move in and actually be. So one thing I noticed is we started out, I said the program would go through 8 o'clock. It's about 8 o'clock. So if you don't mind, I'm actually going to think we'll go through 8:30 so we have time for Q&A here. And so I'll start off with, and just to get some of the technology questions out. This one particularly around transportation. So I think maybe, Lucian, you might be the best person to answer. But as I mentioned, we've seen a lot of new discussions about technologies coming on, new battery types. Are there any in the transportation sector? Are there any new battery types that you see that have like a near-term potential to actually change the needle in terms of transportation?
What we have seen is a number of new applications that folks have been talking about for maybe 10, 15 years, like V2G and all sorts of grid support that vehicles can provide. And we're seeing a lot of traction right now from a lot of the automotive OEMs. They're looking at finally how that can be implemented. And so we're seeing sort of a gradual, I guess, progression towards more and more sophisticated ways to do V2G, and folks are even migrating away from this acronym, is the VGI, now vehicle grid integration, to describe, I guess, milder versions of V2G. There's a number of things that essentially warranties for batteries are from vehicle manufacturers. Battery manufacturers are preventing some of the more pioneering, I guess, and sort of brave ideas to try to rely on on auto battery storage to provide support for the grid. But we are seeing some experiments, some of them here, some of them abroad. Sandboxes offered by various governments. I'm kind of thinking about Japan and China, looking at things where perhaps the driver being technology innovation rather than economic feasibility. Those tend to be places where some of these new ideas tend to get implemented. And so what I have personally seen is still not enough, I guess, adjustment of the technology characteristics to the type of program or product, I should say, type of V2G, for example, that's being experimented with. But there is a trend towards adjusting that. So where, number of cycling of that battery now counts. It's not just one size fits all. That's what I'm trying to say. So yes, I am seeing those kind of clients globally investigating and trying to match battery chemistry, battery capability to the type of application, much more so than it was even 3 years ago. You wanted to?
And then Michael, go ahead, and then we'll have. So Michael.
I haven't seen many crazy new batteries out there, but I think autonomous driving is going to have a big influence on it, because suddenly, instead of buying one car, you'll have a company buying 500 cars and setting them out there. And that's when you can economically gain the benefit of being an EV. You can buy a Tesla now, it's not going to be an investment for the future. Neither is a Leaf. They're fun to drive, that's why you buy them. Owning a fleet, EVs all of a sudden will start making sense.
Just a question, on your point about car manufacturers being an impediment to more vehicle to grid integration, what is preventing the car manufacturers to want to have their batteries? I mean, I realize the battery life may be shortened or there are some technical issues, but it makes so much sense to have car batteries which are just sitting idle for 90% of the time to become a grid support. So why can't they try to monetize this opportunity, which is obvious?
Well, there is an impact, allegedly, right? It's being studied by many. An impact to the performance of the battery, the life of that asset. And so it's preferable to have it sit idle for 90% of the time than, being cycled aggressively. I'm not saying that is the case, but that is the perception today. And so folks want to be able to use for grid support for the 90% of the idle. But these are issues that are being studied right now. And so that's where the world seems to be going. There's a lot of drive from utility companies, customers are looking for value streams that would be available to them. So I guess the technology needs to get to that point where it can support this kind of aggressive cycling, whether it's for peak shifting and shaving applications where we're talking about being able to deep cycle, but not necessarily on high frequency, or whether it's a much smaller market, but what was the initial push for V2G, which was ancillary services. So a lot more variability, high frequency, but not so deep charge and discharge patterns. They're all being studied, and I guess as the economics pan out, based on the technology that's able to support that, I guess the worry and the fear, will dissipate.
So one thing I'd like to add on that is I think it's primarily warranty issues. The car manufacturers put a warranty on the batteries. I actually had the 2011 Leaf that the batteries went out of warranty 2 months after the warranty expired, and Nissan kicked in 80% of that. But still, these are expensive. These are expensive. They have to maintain the financial backing to do the warranty, and they're basing the warranties on transportation only. Bringing in these vehicle to grid type of applications is going to basically have to change their calculations. That said, I think, as Lucien pointed out, there's a number of revenue streams that potentially manufacturers or the owners of the electric cars can participate in. So perhaps as electric cars will come to the market, and as these new vehicle to grid revenue streams and technologies become more understandable, there might be some way that the two can get together and make it actually happen.
I think the one comment I'll add is when we see EVSE deployments and EV deployments, I think the grid service that they provide is more load response. So the most easy go-to-market strategy has been V1G, managed charging rather than actually cycling the battery. Because in theory, it'd be great to participate in frequency regulation markets, but if you do that, you have to register with ISO, add meters. It just increases the development costs, and it's just, and you also go through interconnection processes as well. Because when you're just an EV, you're connected as load. So whenever you add load to the grid, you just notify the utility, or sometimes you don't, depending on how large the load is, and nothing happens. So that's quick deployment. A lot of these OEMs they just want quick deployment of EVs and EVSEs. But when we do V2G, you're actually potentially exporting to the grid. That has grid impacts. You're going to be studied for it. That delays your deployment by 6 months, 7 months, and by that time, maybe your EV driver doesn't care about adopting an EV. So I think those are some of the concerns that we've had in working with some companies that are exploring this.
And also to put things in perspective in terms of scale, the V2G, about an estimated 2.5 gigawatt market opportunity for the US market versus 250 gigawatts for V1G. So 100-fold more opportunity, according to McKinsey study this topic.
I've heard something, sorry, so to prolong this subject, but if it's not personal vehicles, but for example, school buses, right? I think there is some initiative either in California or Hawaii, where school buses also are only used at specific times of the day, in the morning to transport kids and in the afternoon. The rest of the time it's basically sitting idle, and they have huge batteries. So to focus on non-personal vehicles, this type of application may be facilitated or accelerated. What do you think about that?
Well, definitely predictability of the usage pattern can only work to the advantage of the fleet operator and obviously the grid partner. From my experience in terms of deployments around the world, I'm seeing that to be a trend. I'm seeing bus fleets and taxi fleets that are a lot more under control than just I guess the private vehicle market to be a candidate for a first deployment. For example, one of the folks that I've BYD, for example, is deploying in the thousands of buses for the city of Shenzhen in the south, and now they're migrating taxis, which are tens of thousands of taxis. It's a fleet situation again. That seems to be the low-hanging fruit for a lot of countries.
On that same note, it's actually, I've heard a couple of amusing conversations with the utilities who say, let's just buy EVs ourselves, right? And if there's a power emergency, just drive it out to the substation where it needs to go, and we got a mobile battery. And the employees can use it as well, so it's actually no warranty issues, nothing, it's all theirs.
Yeah, actually, that brings up an interesting point, is that the chemistries aren't changing the batteries very quickly. But it's the systems that we're going into. Many of these are really based on digital technologies. There's the networking capabilities, which is certainly recent phenomenon in batteries. There is the software, Michael, you were talking about, being able to control batteries through software, as well as the peripherals that, inverters, things like that. How much, those run on on digital timescale. How much do you see is impact on that, how much of for business models and technology? How much of an impact are you seeing for these technologies on the battery market?
I think it's gonna be huge. I mean, just like the home ownership thing, it's gonna be owned by a big company. They're gonna wheel a bunch of batteries together and sell that capacity. The business model has to be there, because otherwise people can't make money on it. And it's a new frontier, right? I mean, utilities have been controlled monopolies for 150 years. We're moving to a market where it's not that way. How do you guarantee service and people make money? Even in solar right now, one of the biggest areas in solar is solar financing. 8 years ago, that whole market didn't exist. Now there's a ton of venture capital flowing into these. Can these people actually finance better than the person down the street?
Yes, I fully agree. I was just gonna add that, I guess from the day in and day out, sort of week after week, focus on what's really going on in the market. There's a lot of chatter, if you will, about the next more and more powerful, therefore less and less time to charge solution. So folks are talking about DC charging of 150 kilowatt, 400 kilowatt, even higher. That's all the talk that, I have a friend, wink wink, who works for an EVSE company. And that's where most of the focus is really that enlarging the size of that pipeline between the grid and the car. And so there's a race to hundreds of kilowatts of capability to charge, and that's what I'm seeing as being the main driver. Notably, I guess, because we talked about policy and standardization, Japan and China have come out with a standard. Whoever is following this very closely, very interesting development from a policy standpoint, standardizing for DC charging up to and even beyond 600 kilowatt for DC charging. This was just a couple of weeks ago. It's way ahead of everybody else in the US or Europe, talking about standards and agreeing between these two countries to really push these kind of solutions out there. So for whoever's busy in Japan or China, and very soon anywhere in EVSE, this will become incredibly important to be able to be at that level, have product that satisfies that kind of level of charging. We're talking maybe 6 minutes, 8 minutes to charge. It's getting really, really close to going to the gas station and fueling up. So that's just the latest.
Back there, Steph? Also,
So for your presentations, the focus primarily on the supply side, either the energy production, the infrastructure, the regulatory side, regulating the production. Curious, from the demand point of view, I mean, there's a huge shift now in millennials not buying cars, urbanization, changing work patterns, telecommuting. I mean, it's pretty large generational shift going on right now. I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest demand changes in California that we should be thinking about that could totally change the way the markets, the energy of demand will, and how it might affect everything you're talking about?
both transportation and storage?
Oh,
And
yes. I mean, we're talking lifestyle changes that could be, pretty. I mean, for example, back in 2010, we were in recession. Nobody expected this huge ramp in tech in 5 years. Right? It came out of nowhere. When the recovery came, we're looking for surprises like that that could totally change the game.
Okay.
So So I think a driver in terms of transportation is shared economy, because we're talking about not only autonomous or electric vehicles, we're talking about electric vehicles that are also autonomous and they're also shared. So there is this shift in the transportation paradigm where people are not going to have their own vehicles. They're going to be riding on autonomous vehicles that are basically mini buses that will take them from point A to point